Today's video is brought to you by Cars and Bids, my online enthusiast car auction site that recently sold this, and this, and this, and this, and this. Check it out at carsandbids.com. This is the new 2024 Dodge Hornet, and it's Dodge's new compact crossover meant to take on the big rivals like the Honda CR-V and Toyota RAV4. Interestingly, the Hornet is built in Italy, and it shares a lot of its major components with the new Alfa Romeo Tonale, which adds kind of a unique Italian exotic flair to this car. Today, I'm going to review the Hornet and show you all of its quirks and features. Alright, time for the quirks and features of the Dodge Hornet, starting with a little overview of what this is. So like I said, built in Italy, and this is based on the new Alfa Romeo Tonale, which is Alfa Romeo's compact crossover. Here in North America, we're also getting this version, in addition to the Alfa, the Dodge Hornet, which is sort of a less expensive, more entry-level, affordable version of the Tonale from the Dodge brand instead. Now, there are two versions of the Hornet that are available. The base model is called the Hornet GT, or you can upgrade to this one, the Hornet RT. Now, both come standard with all-wheel drive. It's not optional, it's standard, and both are pretty powerful for a compact SUV. The GT comes with a 2-liter turbo 4-cylinder with about 270 horsepower. The RT, this one, comes with a 1.3-liter turbo 4-cylinder that's also a plug-in hybrid, and that's good for 290 horsepower. Both of those are pretty healthy figures in the compact crossover world. Now, the RT version, this one, the plug-in hybrid model, it gets about 30 miles of pure electric driving before the gasoline engine kicks in, and it has a special mode called PowerShot Mode. You're driving around and you pull both shift paddles at once on the steering wheel, and you get a quick burst of 30 extra horsepower for a few seconds if you want like a high-speed pass or a quick acceleration away from a stoplight. Pull those paddles and go into PowerShot Mode. Now, it's worth pointing out that the Alfa Romeo Tonale is also being offered for sale here in North America, but it only comes with the plug-in hybrid powertrain that's offered in the Hornet RT. So if you want the more affordable entry-level version, the Hornet GT is the only way you can get it. It's not available in the Alfa. Now, speaking of affordability, one interesting thing about the Hornet is its pricing. The base model, the Hornet GT, starts around $32,300, or you can upgrade to the GT Plus with more equipment, and that starts around $37,300. But if you want the more powerful plug-in hybrid powertrain, it's $10,000 more, around $42,300 for the base RT, or around $47,300 for the RT Plus. Now, that's interesting for two reasons. Number one, the Alfa Romeo Tonale starts around $45,000, so it's only a few $1,000s more expensive than the Dodge Hornet with the same engine. Of course, the Alfa has a stronger, more exciting, more Italian brand name, and in my opinion, frankly, the Alfa looks a little better. The other interesting thing about the Hornet's pricing is it's a lot more expensive than other compact crossovers. The Honda CR-V, the Toyota RAV4, the Mazda CX-5, the Hornet is pricier than all. Now, the goal is to convince people it's worth the extra money because it has more power, it has this exotic Italian flair, maybe better driving characteristics, but it's unusual for the Dodge brand, which is usually the value brand that's affordable entry level, now going for kind of a higher price point compared to established rivals. We'll see how it works out. It's certainly a gamble. And next up on the outside of the Hornet, let's talk styling. Frankly, I think the Hornet is pretty attractive. It looks nice, good proportions. I just said I think the Tonale is more attractive, and I do think that, but that's not to say the Hornet is ugly. It still is pretty nice looking, but it doesn't really look like a Dodge. Dodge models usually have brawny styling to look muscular and cool and powerful. This one, less so. More curvy, more traditional compact crossover crossover, frankly, a little bit more high-end, probably owing to its European Italian roots compared to other Dodges. Now, there are some interesting quirks on the outside of the Hornet, starting with, well, a Hornet. This fender badge is an actual logo of a Hornet, which of course fits with the name of this car. But that's not the quirkiest badging on the Hornet. Instead, that honor goes to the Dodge badge. The little red slashes you can see on the grille, that's technically Dodge's logo. They use it in advertising, but rarely actually on vehicles. Traditionally, Dodge announces their cars with a crossbar grille, but the Hornet doesn't have that. Instead, the little red slashes have made an appearance on this car, maybe signifying a new Dodge. You also have the red slashes on the back. You can see them on the light bar going across, and it's kind of cool, they're lit up. They look especially cool. The little red slashes set off from the rest of the light bar, a neat little hidden touch, and most people won't even know because most people don't know that is Dodge's logo. And by the way, one other interesting exterior quirk on the outside, I mentioned this car doesn't really look like a Dodge, but from kind of the front quarter angle, you can see a little bit of Charger here. You get these hood vents, you get this narrow headlights, there's a little bit of Charger going on, a little bit of the brawny, muscular Dodge we know well. It's just that the rest of the Hornet doesn't really share the sort of Dodge ethos in terms of its styling. And next up, we move inside the Hornet, where there are some interesting quirks and features, starting with, once again, use of this Dodge logo, the red slashes. You can see them on the headrest, on the seats, both headrests in the front, the little red Dodge slashes, and they make an appearance also on the steering wheel, right in the center, these two slashes. Again, this isn't a logo that's widely known or widely previously used on other Dodge models, but here it is on the Hornet. Now, also around the steering wheel, you have shift paddles, which are pretty impressive. Metal shift paddles and quite large, and they're fixed to the steering column, just like on true high-performance cars. Well, here they are on the Hornet. This is a lot more upscale and high-performance-y than I would expect from a Dodge compact crossover, but maybe that's the point with this car's Italian roots. I also like the seats, which are relatively heavily bolstered Alcantara seats with red perforations in the center. It looks cool, it feels cool, and frankly, it is cool. And I compared this earlier to Toyota RAV4, Honda CR-V. They certainly don't have metal shift paddles, and they definitely don't have red perforated Alcantara seats. Another item worth noting in here, the drive modes. You have a sport mode here in the center. You just press sport, and it tightens up your throttle response, your suspension, directly below the engine start-stop button. But you also have some electric and hybrid drive modes you can access on the steering wheel. This button here marked E-drive modes. You push that to toggle between hybrid, gas and electric, or a pure electric, or a mode called E-save, which increases your recharging of your batteries. More importantly, I should point out that the interior of the Hornet, frankly, is pretty nice. I mentioned the Alcantara seats, the shift paddles, but it's not just that. The layout, the design, the look, leather dashboard with nice red stitching, everything in here looks good and generally feels good, and this interior seems like a pretty nice place to spend time. Again, another benefit over traditional compact crossovers like the CR-V or RAV4. With that said, there are a few items in this interior that I'm a little bit disappointed by because they feel old or just not good enough. One example is the gear selector, which is not electronic. It's a traditional one. You move from park down into drive. Basically, everybody has switched to electronic gear levers. They're safer and they're smaller, but this car still has the old one. Now, I'm also tremendously annoyed by the turn signal stalk, which is just, well, annoying. You put on the turn signal and then the stalk returns to the center even though your turn signal is on. So you go to turn it off by putting it down again and then it stays on. So then you flip it the other direction and then the other side turns on, and it's confounding how you just turn off the turn signal. Why did they have to change this from a normal car turn signal stock? You also have a relatively small infotainment system in this car, which isn't really ideal, especially for the people buying compact crossovers, usually kind of a younger audience who wants a bigger screen. I'll talk more about the tech in a second. But one other thing worth noting, you don't get a sunroof. This is the top spec RT Plus. You'd think you might get a sunroof at this around $50,000 price point, but that isn't the case, and it's a little bit disappointing to see not even a regular one, let alone panoramic. Now, with that said, moving on to the technology in the Hornet, there are some nice benefits, including the gauge cluster screen, which is generally pretty configurable. You can adjust what's shown on the middle screen, which is the majority of the gauge cluster. You can scroll down and see all sorts of things, including a map in fairly large screen and exactly what your music is showing or your phone or various different car informations, trip odometers, etc. It's pretty configurable, although I still wish you could change what was on the outside displays, but I'll take this. It's better than what most rivals offer. I also like the little quirk of the turn signal light pops up on like this ridge rimming the side of the gauge cluster, which is kind of a cool placement. A little minor detail, but one that I find kind of nice. Now, as for the infotainment screen, the touch screen in the center, like I said, it's a little smaller than you'd expect for a vehicle in this segment and compared to rivals, but it has some pros and cons. One of the benefits is the home screen, which you can see here. It's a two-panel screen that shows, well, two things at once, which some rivals can't do, and it's configurable. You can move around exactly which widgets you're seeing on the home screen, depending on what it is you want to prioritize when you're home. So you can see a map and your music at once, which is nice to do. Now, one other benefit of this center screen is it doesn't incorporate the climate controls. They remain fixed buttons below the screen, so when you adjust the climate, you don't have to go into a menu, except that you still do for heated seats, the heated steering wheel, and not just that, but the menu is small, this little tiny part of the screen. You tap that to turn on the heated seats, and it just could be done better. In fact, it should be done better. In the center console, you have 3 buttons to turn off your stability control, your parking sensors, and your automatic parallel parking. 3 things which no one will frequently press. That should be your left heated seat, your right heated seat, and your heated steering wheel, and it's a shame that instead those got integrated into the screen. With that said, generally speaking, I do like this infotainment system. Like I said, home screen is good, and it's also intuitive, quick to respond. It just could be a little bit larger and maybe have a couple of changes, like those heated seat buttons. And next we move on to the back seat in the Hornet, which is, well, frankly, pretty small, actually. The front seat is where I would sit, which is usually my metric of how big the back seat is, and my knees are really pushing right up against it, and I feel even a little claustrophobic with my head. It's not pushing up against the ceiling, but it's really close, and frankly, surprisingly tight back here, especially compared to Honda CR-V, Toyota RAV4, which have evolved into relatively larger, almost mid-sized crossovers that really could do family duty. This thing feels like it might be a little small for that. Now, with that said, backseat does have some nice amenities. You have climate control vents back here and 2 individual ones for rear seat passengers, which you don't always get in vehicles in this segment. You also have 2 charge ports, USB-A and USB-C, so you can choose. And you have the same Alcantara seat centers with red inside as you do up front, which adds to the luxury of the back seat. It might not be incredibly roomy, but it does look cool back here. And then there's the cargo area, which interestingly feels even smaller than the back seat. It's kind of odd. It's narrow, especially. It doesn't really extend to the sides of the car like so many other cargo areas do, so it seems kind of compact, and frankly, it's not all that long either. It just isn't that big. The cargo area and the rear seat being pretty small surprises me, because the Hornet at 178 inches long is only 2 inches shorter than the Toyota RAV4, which frankly feels a lot bigger inside than this car. It seems unusually small, maybe not great packaging, and frankly it feels a little smaller than it should. Now, there is cargo storage below the floor, as you can see. Lift this up and there's a little extra space there, although not a lot. Not enough to make up for not having any storage on the sides, but one nifty little trick, the cargo storage floor can kind of lock into place, almost like a tailgate that's up, and so you can root around in your stuff a little bit easier than you might in most cars, where the floor is always falling on you while you're doing it. But again, doesn't really make up for the lack of space back here. All right, driving the Dodge Hornet, which isn't a very ambitious name for this vehicle. It's actually a rather diminutive name for a car that is kind of punches above its weight class, at least on paper. It's got pretty good horsepower, 290 horses, and that extra with the paddle pull. It's built in Italy, standard all-wheel drive. It's more expensive than its rivals. I mean, this is like exciting. Like, it's intended to be, for once, Dodge is not making the budget alternative in this segment or any segment. This is actually a car that is intended to be better, more exciting, more thrilling, more better equipped with the Italian heritage than all of its rivals. The Hornet makes it seem like it's not that stuff, but it is. So from just kind of a cruising around perspective, well, it cruises around just fine. A lot of the crossovers, or basically all of the crossovers in this segment, drive about the same. Everybody's like, oh, the Mazda CX-5 is the sporty one. Well, a little. But I mean, we're talking about compact crossovers here. It's not like the Mazda CX-5 has some grand advantage. I will say that the CX-5, I think, does a good job of fooling people into thinking that it's very sporty because the steering is pretty heavy. They do a good job with the steering feel. The handling is actually fairly similar to other small crossovers, but the steering feel does a good job with some of the car journalists. And this vehicle is sort of similar to that. It has certainly sharper steering feel than what you would get from, you know, a RAV4 or a CR-V, which are pretty dull. And it doesn't quite match the kind of heavier weighted steering feel that you do get from that Mazda CX-5. So in a sense, I could see someone saying the CX-5 is sort of the sportier alternative even compared to this. Where this shines unquestionably is the horsepower figure. I mean, 290 is a really big number for a compact crossover. You know, the RAV4, even the hybrid RAV4 is like 200, 220, 230, something like that. It's not a lot of power. Just gonna step on it here. It goes. I mean, it really legitimately goes. It's like a quick vehicle. It feels quick. It's not a V8, it's not some sports car, but good mid-range power, good low-range power. It feels a lot quicker than a 1 whatever 4-cylinder would suggest. You do get a little bit of that droning that you get in some like Chrysler, Fiat Alpha engines at the top of the rev range, where it just doesn't sound great. It's a little engine that's working very hard, but it does provide you with a good amount of power and more than you would get in a lot of these kind of more established rivals. As for the handling, it really does feel a little bit stronger than rivals in terms of the way it actually goes around corners. It does a pretty decent job of that. I wish the steering was a little bit heavier because I think it would serve to accentuate the handling being pretty good. Steering feels pretty light, and it especially feels light when you start to get going, and that's not really an ideal situation if you want to emphasize how sporty the car is. Even though the vehicle itself is pretty composed around corners and relatively flat, especially for a compact crossover, feels more engaging. The steering kind of screws with that and doesn't quite make it as fun as I think this car could be. The transmission is an interesting thing. The base model actually has a 9-speed. The nicer version, this one, the RT, has a 6-speed auto. And I haven't driven the base model, but it doesn't feel like you're missing out on much. It does a good job of getting to the power band quickly, and it's a smooth transmission. The Hornet feels quiet. It feels like nice place to spend time. Decent driving position, tall like you want a crossover to be, quiet, a little more tire noise than I might expect, a little more engine noise at the top of the rev range than I might expect, but certainly none of these things are deal breakers. It drives and feels like a, you know, good, reasonable compact crossover. Now, I think that it becomes a little bit more of a challenge when you start thinking about the price point. It's a good compact crossover, a good CR-V rival or Toyota RAV4, but it's priced higher than that. I mean, ultimately, it's got more power, it's got standard all-wheel drive, more equipment, and so they feel they can justify that, but you're also coming up against some really established names in those vehicles. Now, the benefit here is you do get this plug-in hybrid drivetrain, which is kind of what everybody's after in a compact crossover right now, but you are paying a lot, and when you get into RT territory, like I mentioned, you're starting to flirt with the Alfa Tonale, which looks better and obviously has a much better brand name than Dodge. But overall, it's a good car that has a lot of positive attributes. I just have to wonder, if I was thinking about getting one of these, why wouldn't I just go and get the Alfa and spend a little bit more and get a better looking car with a better brand name? I have a suspicion that's what I would do, and that's what a lot of people would do. And so I think that the entry-level versions of the Hornet might sell okay, because they're cheaper and the Alfa doesn't have a comparison point. But I think the plugins are going to have a harder time finding buyers, and maybe ultimately will only find buyers when people just really want to plug in and they're supply constrained in other vehicles, which is kind of how the Chrysler Pacifica plug-in has become a big success. And I have a suspicion that might happen here too. You can't find a RAV4 Prime or a Tucson hybrid. Well, Dodge makes the Hornet, and I bet they'll have some deals on them. And so that might be where this car finds buyers. And so that's It's the new 2024 Dodge Hornet, Dodge's new compact crossover. There's a lot to like here, and it certainly has some unique traits compared to the usual little SUVs with its Italian flair and plug-in hybrid drivetrain. And now it's time to give the new Hornet a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 48 out of 100, which puts the Dodge Hornet here against some rivals. The Hornet is great, actually, boasting some fully electric driving capabilities and strong performance, and the interior quality is decent too. The drawbacks are a slightly tight interior and relatively high pricing, especially considering the Dodge brand name.